The Christmas tree glowed with 1,000 tiny lights, each one a small lie in the Vance family living room. I stood alone in the kitchen, arranging fragile porcelain figurines on the buffet, the same ritual I'd performed for 28 years, the same role I'd been cast in since childhood, the quiet one, the useful one, the invisible one. "Serafina, get these out to the dining room." My mother's voice carried from somewhere upstairs, sharp and demanding as always. I moved without hesitation, without resentment. At least, that's what I told myself. The truth was more complicated. The resentment had been simmering for years, a slow burn I'd learned to hide beneath layers of compliance and forced smiles. My older sister Vivian swept into the kitchen wearing a designer dress that cost more than my monthly apartment rent. She was laughing at something our father had said in the living room, that particular laugh she reserved for moments when she felt superior to everyone around her. "God, this party is so boring," she announced to no one in particular, tossing her hair. "Dad promised to take us to Aspen next year. At least there'll be people worth talking to." I didn't respond. I never did. It was easier that way. She grabbed the bowl of gravy I'd spent an hour preparing. My grandmother's recipe, the one thing in this house that was actually mine, and spun around dramatically to show off her dress. Her hip caught the edge of the buffet. The bowl flew from her hands in slow motion, and I watched, almost mesmerized, as 3 pounds of thick brown gravy splattered across the front of my favorite velvet dress, the one I'd saved for months to buy. "You clumsy idiot!" Vivian shrieked, her face flushing with rage. "Look what you made me do. This is a Valentino." "It was an accident," I said quietly, looking down at the damage. "The dress was ruined." "Of course it was." "Your presence is the accident," she hissed. That's when my father appeared in the doorway. Richard Vance was a man who'd built his empire on charm, manipulation, and an almost supernatural ability to make others feel small. He owned Vance Properties, a real estate portfolio worth roughly $40 million, or so we all believed. What we didn't know was that the empire was rotting from the inside, held together by debt, desperation, and a line of credit he'd been bleeding dry for years. He looked at the gravy-stained dress. He looked at my face. And then his expression hardened into something I'd seen 1,000 times before: contempt. "Serafina, I've had enough," he said, his voice low and controlled, which somehow made it worse than if he'd shouted. "Every single Christmas, you find a way to embarrass this family. Every year, you manage to ruin what should be our perfect evening." "Dad, I didn't." "Don't interrupt me." He stepped closer, and I felt my body go rigid. "I told you this year would be different. I told you to make yourself useful or make yourself scarce. Instead, you've done both. You've proven yourself both useless and a liability." "Richard, perhaps," my mother began from the living room, but her voice lacked any real conviction. He ignored her. He was focused entirely on me now, and there was a satisfaction in his eyes that I'd never quite understood until that moment. He enjoyed this. He enjoyed the power of it. "Get out," he said quietly. "Get your pathetic belongings and get out of this house. And don't come back until you've learned how to earn a living like a normal person." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. I'd imagined this scene 100 times, sometimes as a child lying in bed, sometimes as a teenager sitting in my room coding late into the night, sometimes as a young adult watching my parents spend money on Vivian's endless desires while I worked part-time jobs to pay for my own education. But I'd never actually believed it would happen. "You're not serious," I whispered. "Do I look like I'm joking?" He grabbed my arm, not roughly enough to leave a mark, just hard enough to make a point, and steered me toward the front door. My mother watched from the living room doorway with the expression of someone observing a minor household inconvenience. Vivian smirked, and I watched something shift in her eyes. Relief, perhaps. The satisfaction of having finally succeeded in getting me out of the house. The cold hit me first as my father shoved me onto the porch. December in the city was brutal, and I was wearing nothing but the gravy-stained dress and a thin cardigan. "Merry Christmas," he said, and then the door slammed shut behind me. I stood on the frozen porch for exactly 30 seconds. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. Instead, I felt something shift inside me, a fundamental realignment of my entire worldview. The hurt was there, yes, deep and primal. But underneath it was something else: clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when you finally stop waiting for people to change and accept them for exactly what they are: predators. I pulled out my phone, the private one, not the one I used for my other life, and made 3 calls. Within an hour, I was checking into the Regency suite at the Peninsula Hotel using my corporate credit card. The suite cost more per night than my parents gave Vivian for her monthly allowance, and I didn't hesitate for a second. By 3 in the morning, I was sitting on a leather sofa overlooking the glittering city, my laptop open on my lap, my mind running through calculations and possibilities. The penthouse was warm, the view was beautiful, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. My name is Serafina Vance, and I'm the CEO and founder of Innovate Key, a high-security cloud computing platform that had just been valued at $68 million. My family didn't know. They had no idea that while they were mocking my little computer projects, I'd been building something revolutionary. The irony was almost too perfect to bear. I'd started Innovate Key when I was 23 years old, right after I'd drained my college savings, $40,000, to cover a massive operational gap in my father's company. That money was supposed to fund my computer science degree. Instead, it had gone into Vance Properties, and in exchange, I'd received exactly what I'd always received: nothing. No gratitude. No acknowledgement. Just more work, more demands, more subtle reminders that I would never be good enough. So I'd made a different choice. I'd stopped asking my parents for anything. I'd worked nights and weekends. I'd built Innovate Key in borrowed office space, funded by angel investors who saw my vision and understood my technical genius in a way my own family never would. For 5 years, I'd lived a double life. On the surface, I was still Serafina the scapegoat, working menial jobs, asking for loans, receiving verbal abuse as casually as other people received compliments. Underneath, I was building an empire. The company's core innovation was a security architecture so elegant, so unbreakable, that even my own team hadn't fully grasped its complexity. It was the kind of system that governments wanted, that corporations would pay millions for, that could only have been designed by someone with a particular combination of obsessive precision and creative genius. Someone like me. But there was something else. Something most people didn't know. Years ago, when my father had asked me to build a cheap, custom database for Vance Properties, I'd said yes immediately. It seemed like a simple project, just something to organize their property listings and financial records. Except I'd built something far more sophisticated. I'd installed a master backdoor, a hidden administrative override that I could access from anywhere in the world. I'd also discovered something in their financial records, a technical default clause in their line of credit, a clause that their regional bank hadn't even noticed was there. A clause that would trigger immediate default if certain digital conditions weren't met. Conditions that only I knew how to satisfy. I'd put that backdoor there as insurance. Not because I'd planned anything at that point, but because I'd learned long ago never to trust my father. If he ever tried to frame me for fraud or manipulate my work, I'd wanted a way to protect myself. I'd never imagined I'd use it for something like this. At 4 in the morning, I made the first call. Mr. Klein? Yes, I know it's early. I need you to come to my office. And bring coffee. This is going to take a while. Marcus Klein was my head of legal and acquisitions, and he was ruthless in the way that only truly ethical people can be. He understood that sometimes justice required precision, and sometimes precision required doing things that made ordinary people uncomfortable. I laid out my plan for him over coffee in my office, watching his expression shift from confusion to shock to a kind of grim understanding. You're going to bankrupt your own family, he said finally. I'm going to enforce the terms of a financial agreement that they violated, I corrected. And I'm going to do it legally. The emotional component is irrelevant, I said, and I meant it. In that moment, I truly believed I meant it. What matters is that they violated a contract. What matters is that my father has been using me as an emotional punching bag for 28 years. What matters is that I'm tired. Marcus studied me for a long moment. Okay, he said finally. Tell me what you need. What I needed was simple: anonymously purchase every outstanding liability connected to Vance Properties. All of it. The loans, the credit lines, the overextended margin accounts. Everything. Don't let them know it's me, I instructed. Use shell companies if you have to. I want them to think this is a random acquisition. I want them to panic. And I want them to understand eventually that they have no one to blame but themselves. Marcus's team worked with impressive speed. Within 3 days, they'd confirmed what I'd already suspected: Vance Properties was a sinking ship. My father had been bleeding the company dry for years, maintaining his lifestyle through a combination of increasing debt and what could only be described as financial delusion. The company's real value was less than $10 million, and that was being generous. By the end of the week, Innovate Key owned every significant financial liability connected to Vance Properties. The next step was the default clause. On January 8th, at exactly 9 a.m., I sent a message through Mr. Klein's legal team to activate the digital condition that would trigger the technical default clause in the line of credit. From a technical standpoint, it was elegant. A simple manipulation of the database I'd built, a small change that wouldn't be noticed by their bank for at least a few hours. When the bank's systems finally flagged the issue and cross-referenced it with the terms of the loan agreement, the effect was immediate. Vance Properties' line of credit was terminated. All outstanding balances became due in full within 21 days. Their corporate accounts were frozen. Their cash flow stopped. The silence that followed was remarkable. My father didn't call. Neither did my mother or Vivian. I'd almost expected them to reach out immediately, to beg me to fix whatever computer problem had emerged, but instead there was just nothing. Radio silence. I imagined them in that house, the one they'd bought with money that wasn't really theirs, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. On day 14, Vivian showed up at my old apartment complex, the cheap place I'd rented before Innovate Key became truly profitable, before I'd moved to the downtown loft that I kept hidden from my family. She drove her expensive BMW in circles through the parking lot, looking confused and increasingly desperate. She didn't find me, of course. Eventually, she drove away, screaming into her phone about how much she hated everyone. I watched from a coffee shop across the street, and I felt nothing. On day 20, as the deadline approached, my father made a final, desperate move. He reached out to a distant cousin, someone he hadn't spoken to in years, and sent an emotional text message. I received it third-hand, forwarded by the cousin with a note of concern. Tell Serafina that a computer glitch caused a massive system failure. Tell her to come home immediately and fix it. This is her responsibility. Tell her that her family needs her. Tell her I'm sorry for Christmas. The apology felt almost like an insult. It was so small, so inadequate, so clearly born of panic rather than genuine remorse. I did nothing. For 3 more days, I did absolutely nothing. Then, on day 21, I called Mr. Klein. Send them the notice, I said. All of it. The legal notice that arrived at Vance Properties offices was typed on official letterhead, signed by lawyers who had no idea who was actually behind it. It stated, simply and clearly, that the company was in immediate default on all outstanding obligations. All assets were seized. The primary residence, the house I'd grown up in, the house my father had thrown me out of on Christmas Eve, was officially scheduled for foreclosure in 72 hours. I imagined my father's face when he read it. I imagined the panic, the confusion, the desperate phone calls to every lawyer he knew. I imagined him sitting in that living room, finally understanding that he was going to lose everything. What I didn't imagine, what I truly didn't see coming, was the final piece of the puzzle. On the evening of day 23, my father found a way to reach me. He used a disposable corporate phone that he'd somehow managed to acquire, something clearly bought in a panic at a convenience store. His voice, when I picked up, was different than I'd ever heard it before. It was stripped of all pretense, all charm, all narcissistic confidence. It was the voice of a desperate man who finally understood that he'd lost. Serafina, listen to me. Please. Just listen. He was breathing hard, as if he'd been running. I know you're angry. I know I deserve this. But I have an overseas account, an emergency fund. It's substantial. Enough to fix this. But it requires 2-factor authentication, and the codes are tied to the custom database you built. I need you to log in. I need you to authorize the withdrawal. Please. Vivian is in her room. Your mother is. I don't even know where your mother is. If you don't help me, we lose everything." I could hear the truth in his voice. He really would lose everything. The house, the company, the lifestyle, the carefully constructed image of success. It would all be gone. For a moment, just a moment, I felt something that might have been mercy. Then I remembered Christmas Eve. I remembered the gravy, the shame, the cold. I remembered 28 years of small cruelties and large betrayals. I remembered the $40,000 I'd never been repaid. I remembered the sound of his contempt in his voice when he told me I was worthless. "I can't log in," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "The system is encrypted beyond my current access level." "That's not true," he said desperately. "You built it. You can access anything." "Actually," I said softly, "there's only one person who can successfully bypass the two-factor lock now. The original programmer. The person you called useless." I heard his breath catch. He finally understood. "Serafina, please." I hung up. That night, I sat in my penthouse and pulled up the preliminary reports on the Innovate Key acquisition. The company was being purchased by a consortium of tech investors and venture capital firms for an undisclosed sum. The valuation had been finalized at $68 million. But there was something in the acquisition documents that I'd never shared with anyone, something that explained why the price was so high. The buyers had specifically requested the security architecture, the same elegant, unbreakable system that I'd designed 5 years ago. The same system that was now installed in my father's database. They wanted it for government contracts, for defense work, for applications that would literally secure the digital infrastructure of the country. My childhood trauma, the very skill they'd mocked, was worth more than my father's entire lifetime of work. The closing would happen within 2 weeks. After that, I would be substantially wealthy in a way that went far beyond the company valuation. I would be secure, untouchable, free. But first, there was one last thing I needed to do. I flew back into the city on a private jet owned by Innovate Key's parent company. I had Mr. Klein meet me at a private airfield, and from there we drove to the house on Maple Street. The one with the broken gutter and the front door that my father had slammed in my face exactly 24 days ago. It was dark when we pulled up. The windows were mostly dark, except for the faint glow of a single lamp in the living room. I could see shadows moving inside, and I imagined my parents and Vivian sitting among packed boxes, trying to figure out where their lives had gone so wrong. "You don't have to do this," Mr. Klein said quietly. He was a good man, a careful man, and he understood the difference between justice and cruelty. "I know," I said. "But I want to." I stepped out of the car alone, carrying a leather briefcase that contained every acquisition document, every deed, every transfer of ownership. My heels clicked against the frozen pavement, and the sound felt powerful. I didn't knock. I simply opened the front door and walked in. My father was sitting in an armchair, his face gaunt and gray. Vivian was curled on the sofa, her designer clothes replaced with sweatpants and a wrinkled sweater. My mother was nowhere to be seen. The Christmas tree was still up, its lights dark, its needles brown and dropping onto the floor. When my father saw me, something in his expression shifted. For just a moment, I saw hope flicker across his face. Then he understood. "No," he whispered. I said nothing. I simply walked to the coffee table, the same table where our Christmas feast had been laid out just weeks before, and opened my briefcase. I removed 3 documents and placed them carefully in front of him. "Serafina," Vivian started, her voice taking on that familiar false sweetness. "Thank God you're here. We need you too." "I'm not here to help," I said quietly. "I'm here to finalize an acquisition." I looked directly at my father. "The first document is the deed to this house. It's now owned by my subsidiary holding company. The second document is the transfer of ownership for Vance Properties. You're in default, the company is seized, and everything within it is now my property. The third document is your choice." I turned to face both of them now, and I let them see exactly who I'd become. "You can sign over the business for $1, a symbolic sale, and I will allow you and Vivian to live in a small rental unit that I own approximately 3 blocks from here. I will cover your rent for exactly 1 year. After that, You're on your own. You'll need to learn how to earn a living. Or, my father whispered, though I could see he already knew. Or you refuse, and tomorrow morning, you face immediate, public bankruptcy and eviction. I own your debt. I own your property. I own your future. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then my father looked at the documents, and I watched his entire empire reduce itself to a signature line and a single dollar. His hand shook as he signed. Vivian started to cry, real tears now, not the manipulative kind, and slumped deeper into the sofa, finally grasping that her wedding would be cancelled, that her allowance would never resume, that her entire carefully constructed life was gone. I felt no satisfaction. I felt no vindication. I felt only a clear, cold sense of completion. This was justice. Not cruel, not excessive, not even angry. Just fair. I zipped my briefcase and stood to leave. At the doorway, I turned back one last time. The apartment is modest, I said, my voice calm and final. But it's safe, and it's yours. For 1 year. After that, you're on your own. Learn how to earn a living. I walked out into the cold night air, and it felt crisp and clean. The epilogue writes itself. 3 months later, Innovate Key was officially acquired for $68 million, with an additional $15 million in performance bonuses that I would receive over the next 5 years. I was 30 years old, phenomenally wealthy, and entirely free. My parents and Vivian lived in the modest apartment I'd provided. My father, stripped of his business and his money, finally learned what humility felt like. Vivian, for the first time in her life, had to work for a living. My mother, caught between loyalty to her husband and the undeniable reality of her daughter's genius, eventually reached out. I didn't refuse her contact, but I also didn't offer forgiveness. That would have to be earned. But that's a different story. The most important thing was this: I was no longer Serafina the scapegoat. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer waiting for my family to see my worth. I had walked away, and in doing so, I had thrived. My worth was never in question. It was only waiting for me to step into my own power and refuse to apologize for it. And that, perhaps, was the sweetest revenge of all. If you've made it this far, you understand, respect is non-negotiable. My worth wasn't defined by my father kicking me out on Christmas or Vivian's cruel insults. My story proves that silence can be a weapon, and patience, the patience to let their debt mature, can be absolute power. If this resonated with you, if a narcissistic family has called your ambition useless, tell them this: your silence doesn't make you weak. Your boundaries don't make you difficult. Your survival makes you extraordinary. Never let their arrogance overshadow your genius. The revolution happens when you decide to write your own ending. They thought I was a burden. I became the CEO who owned their company and their debt. Share your story below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.